welcome to the stories of Northern life from the Sault Ste. Marie Museum. This episode is a historical recording of the Sault Ste. Marie and 49th Field Regiment Historical Society meeting in the 1970s. You will be presented with the history of St. Joe's Island with a few ending questions and atmospheric sounds from the meeting group. I hope you learn a little something new about St. Joe's Island today.
The early history of St. Joe's Island, Mr. Rains.
I guess I can use this.
For you to use.
Well, I'm usually behind the camera and not in front of it, so this is a little strange for me, but we'll start. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The story and history of St. Joe's Island is long and extremely interesting. And it's going to be difficult for me to give the overall picture completely. I'm bound to miss some of the main items, and if perhaps I do, at the end of this speech or this story, I'm going to ask you people to ask any questions on any subject, and I'll try to relate an answer of some sort for it. I hope I don't leave anybody important out, because I feel that the research I've done is very extensive, and if I do, I'm going to feel bad about it. But if I do, mention it to me, please. At any rate, the history is very interesting, and nowhere can we find a more detailed and accurate account than is found in the book Historic St. Joe's Island. And I should say St. Joseph Island, for that is the true name of it, but most of us today call it St. Joe's, and therefore I hope you will forgive me. I'll just use that name because we're so used to calling it by that. This book was published in 1938 by Joseph and Estella Bayless. Mrs. Bayless was mainly responsible for the publication of it, but however, her husband, being a noted historian of our area, and he wrote a number of books that were published in the United States and Canada, and about all various subjects, I'm sure gave her quite a hand with it. Her Mrs. Bayless was a granddaughter of Major Rains, and therefore, as myself being, was a direct descendant. So it gives me extreme pleasure to talk to this organization on a dear subject of St. Joe's Island, and to relate some of the historic works that were so thoughtfully put in print by the husband and wife team some 30 years ago. We'll begin with some of the history of the island itself. The island itself is approximately 600 feet above sea level, and the highlands of St. Joseph, or the mountain as it's called in the island, is some 1,400 feet above sea level. The length is 20 miles and the width 11.5, the acreage being 90,000. The main foundation of the island is limestone and is similar to that of the Niagara and Manitoulin district. The soil varies from clay to sandy loam. The early history of the island can be claimed by Indians, first of all, the Frenchmen, and British. First white man to see the island was a Frenchman named Burrell in 1622. Although the exact route he followed is uncertain, some historians believe he turned north towards the Sioux, and if so, he must have navigated the narrow passage we now know as Devil's Gap, which we all can see as we enter the ferry to our left. Not too much happened between 1622 and 1792. some 170 years. However, the value of St. Joseph Island was etched in many a man's mind, and in 1792, the Northwest Company opened a trading post, or establishment, at the end of the island, later to be known as Rains Point. Fur was the name of the game, and it had just begun. The U.S., the French, the English, they were battling over the friendship of the Indians, and the British seemed to have succeeded in that matter in 1783. However, with the passing of the Paris Treaty establishing peace between Britain and the United States, the British had to explore for a new location other than Michilimackinac. I'm going to say that pretty wrong. Sorry about that. Difficult indeed was it to find another post to compare. Various sites were considered, but the Jay's Treaty of 1794 stipulated that the post must be handed over by June 1st, 1796. No further delay was possible, and St. Joseph Island became the lifesaver. In the year 1796, Lieutenant Foster was sent to St. Joseph to begin a trading post on the southwest end of the island, where later Fort St. Joseph was to stand. The Indians, suspicious of the Americans, and remembering the English had always been kind to them, soon found their way in seeking both trade and rum from the British, and negotiations for the purchase of the island went forward in the year 1798. The day, June 20th, on the grounds adjoining the fort, the passing of the material goods to the Indian chief of the Chippewa Nation made good the purchase of the island, and the trading soon began to equal almost that of Michilimackinac. But by June 1808, agreement with the British and the U.S. made it possible for import and export of furs at a low cost to the traders. So finding it cheaper to operate one trading post, St. Joe's Island was again abandoned, and the settlement dwindled away, leaving only the fort manned by a small detachment. In the fall of 1811, Captain Charles Roberts, who now commanded at St. Joe's, faced the fact that the men under his command were approaching a winter of bitter cold and without overcoats. Appeals to headquarters for new coats met no response. So the resourceful commander had coats made for his men out of Hudson blade blankets. This same captain, a year later, in 1812, after war was declared between Britain and the U.S., was to make his mark in history by leading 300 white men and 400 to 500 Indians from St. Joseph Island to Mackinac to capture it in his country's name. Captain Roberts' own words, "No blood was drawn from man or beast." Some of the Sioux volunteers, it's interesting to note here, were John Johnston, George Ermatinger.
Charles.
No, I got George.
Okay. Oh, yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Pardon me. Augustine Nolan also is there. There was one small sailing vessel, 10 boats, and 70 canoes, which carried the men across the waters for the very important mission. Although many Indians had left the fort at Mackinac, and Lieutenant Porter Hawks, then in command, was feeling very uneasy and sure there was something wrong, he was yet to get official information in regards to the war, and therefore was caught fully unprepared. Captain Roberts had achieved a very important success for the British, and the British were to hold the fort until the end of the war, and therefore hold the fur trade almost wholly. However, in the spring of 1829, we saw the Fort St. Joe's abandoned, and the buildings were left for nature to consume. The history of St. Joe's Island would be hard to tell if one left out the name of William Kingdom Rains. For as early as 1825, while serving in the British Army in Europe, he was fascinated by the maps showing the Great Lake area. Visualizing it as one of the world's future waterways, he decided that sooner or later he would visit this area and perhaps to stay. So in the year 1830, he came to Canada and settled at Simcoe. He built a fine home, and with his wife and 2 boys and sister-in-law, lived for 4 years. Incidentally, if I may inject here now, the house that he did build was sold at the time, 4 years after he built it, to a lady of great means, and she increased the size of the home, however not obstructing what was there already. And in 1948, the Ontario government, through the Department of Lands and Forests, created a provincial park in the area, bought the home, restored it to its original furnishings and so forth, and the home is there now for the public to view. So that's right at the head of Simcoe, Lake Simcoe. It's right on the lake. You can see, I don't exactly know the right roads or anything, but...
It's Lake Simcoe, it isn't the town of Simcoe.
No, Lake Simcoe, yes.
Near William?
Yes.
Which road is it?
Well, I'm sorry I haven't been there, but there was a full page of information in the Sioux Star, and last night I tried to look it up, but we have moved, and I'm afraid that through my travels it's perhaps in the museum or someplace else, but if you are interested and would like to go there, I will look for it further and bring it to the next meeting, and so you can have a look at it, okay? In fact, maybe there'll be something in tomorrow night's paper about it, because I mentioned it to Mrs. Johnson.
Mrs. Johnson.
Yes, and she said that she'd try to look it up and see if she could find it. If she could, she'd mention it. But unfortunately, I haven't lost it, but I've misplaced it. So in the, let's see now, where was I? So in the year 1830, he came to Canada and settled at Simcoe, Lake Simcoe. He built a fine home, and with his wife and 2 boys and son and sister-in-law, lived there for 4 years. However, the waterways was his dream, and in the year 1834, he wrote a letter to the governor of Upper Canada, which read, and I shall read it in part, and I'm quoting from his granddaughter's book. Our proposal is to settle 100 families on the island and to form a steam communication through Lake Huron, which will evidently bring not only our own production, but those of the whole of Michigan Territory, by the proposed route through Lake Simcoe to the Bay of Quinte, and having a force sufficient to curb the vacant population in the neighborhood. The advantages to themselves must depend on their energy and judgment in settling and making the best of the capabilities the island may offer.
You got the right number, you just phone again.
Well, we all know what happened. Major Raines obtained this charter and chose as associates his neighbors Archibald Hamilton Scott, an Englishman, and Charles Thompson, a Toronto promoter. They built a vessel which they loaded in the spring of 1835. Which they loaded in the spring of 1835 with sawmill machinery and merchandise for a store. They landed on the island in a small bay, which Major Raines proceeded to name Milford Haven after an old country favorite spot of his. By the year 1839, or 3 years after the partners came to the island, two, namely Raines and Scott, had withdrawn from the company, while Charles Thompson had turned his attention to commercialization of the possibilities, having found the original ideas of colonizing the island impractical. I think what mainly happened was they just couldn't get people to come up there, that's all. They were in wilderness enough, and probably in the Toronto and Montreal areas. So, but Mr. Thompson had a tiger by the tail. For in the first half of 1839, over 1 million pounds of maple sugar was shipped from the island, bringing him $75,000, and 600 barrels of fish, bringing him also a large amount, unknown to me at this time, but it was a large amount. All good things on the island, the timber, the animals, the limestone, good soil, the fish, and many other things. It was almost a sure thing that there would be copper somewhere there. And with the Bruce mines, which opened in 1846, and stories from the Indians about copper on the island, in the year of 1850, the settlers abandoned all their other pursuits to prospect for metals. And of course, Major Raines wasn't to be left out. One foggy night, Major Raines and his two eldest sons were looking for metal and got lost. And in the morning, they came out on the easterly shore of the island, where there were so many hills that the Major dubbed it Hilltown, and later shortened it to Hilton. Since Major Raines was known not only as being one of the first pioneers of the island, but also for having 3 wives, all at the same time, I would like to, at this time, quote from his granddaughter's book some facts. Frances and Estellas, I think I'll get her name right if I try it once more. Eliza, pardon me, I can never think of that. Frances and Eliza Doubleday were daughters of an English attorney who practiced in Wales. Their mother died when they were very young children. Their eldest brother migrated to Australia and faded from knowledge. Another brother was shot in a hunting accident. Frances and Eliza were then placed into an exclusive private school, and after their father's death, spent their vacations with their married sister, who, however, died in 1825. The 2 sisters and William Kingdom Raines were all members of an English aristocracy. Sometime after their arrival on St. Joe's Island, and if I may stop here to also explain that Major Raines made an alliance with Frances Doubleday in England after leaving his wife, abandoning his wife with 1 child, pretty well fixed though for money and so forth, and then having a child by Frances Doubleday, so that he came to Canada with a wife, but unmarried at the time, and his sister. So the 2 sisters were devoted to each other and both loved the same man. So the eternal triangle. There were no other eligible men there equal in culture and birth, so the Major solved the problem by forming an alliance with both the girls and providing a separate dwelling for each, having 13 children by Frances and 9 by her sister. The 2 families grew up side by side, and this is contrary to popular belief, had the deepest respect and affection for each other. The Major gave his name to his children, and they were proud to bear it, respecting him and adoring their mothers. One third of Major Raines's adult life was spent in the service of his country, and most of it in warfare. his declining years were passed at Westfield, which is a farm still owned by the Rains family in Sailors Encampment, where he died on October 19, 1874, at the age of 85. Perhaps at this point, one may say that I'm blowing my own horn by blowing up my ancestry. But if I may say, I think that most of us have something to learn from this great man and his experiences. Many other men played a very important role in the history of the island. Men like John Richardson and John Richards, who came to the island to sell his land but never left it. John Marks and Reverend H. Beer, the first resident Anglican clergyman, and another fellow, Archibald, who was very celebrated by the menfolk for opening the first hotel. A.C. Duncan and many others who will go down in history as great builders. At this point, I'd like to open the meeting for questions.
What's the story of the mix-up in the name of Hilton Beach and Marshville?
Well, at the time, and if you know the history, I mentioned in the last paragraph of my speech, or my story, I should say, and I gathered by now most of you know that I'm very unfamiliar with doing things like this, so I can really watch it up. That one of the great men on the island was Marx, and he was responsible, I think you probably know, for starting Hilton. But unfortunately, the earlier maps of the island, which were made before Marx arrived there, carried the name of Hilton. The town of Hilton carried that name, you see the point. So actually, so many people referred it to it as Hilton Beach or Hilton Town, that this Marksville just didn't catch on. Now, a lot of people that lived right there would call it Marksville, I imagine. I don't know what happened up in Jamestown here. That's quite an interesting history. But due to the fact, I think, that it was marked on the map, it just stuck, and that was all there to it. And of course, I don't think Mr. Marx was there too long. I think he was only there for about 15 years or so.
He was more interested in loose mines.
I think so, yeah. But Mr. Marx was responsible for starting what we now know as the government dock at Hilton Beach, and he sold wood to the steamers, the boats going up, and made commerce there, and also was responsible as a shipper. For example, if I was doing logging in the bush, I'd take my logs there and leave them with him, and he would saw to it that were shipped out on the particular boat and where they're going to go and so forth.
Where was the first hotel?
If you allow me to...
No,
I have it right here.
Is the Rangemere Hotel?
Was the Ottawa House?
What's the connection?
The Rangemere Hotel was built by one of my family, and the ownership of it was held within the family for a good number of years. It's the name of the original owner escapes me, but however, my whole family built the Range Museum, or the Rangemere, and they all worked together on it. And I think the financing was done through the family itself too, you see, and gradually paid back. So that at one particular time, I knew that my Uncle Pitt Rains, who died recently, had a considerable amount to do with the hotel, but unfortunately I never had the opportunity of talking with him, you know. So, but one interesting fact is that I married a girl from the Sioux, and her mother's mother worked in the hotel in the kitchen for about 7 or 8 years. So I know I can talk to her anyway.